heart of California's scorching Mojave Desert lies the dilapidated remains of the Royal Hawaiian Motel, a forsaken structure standing as a silent witness to years of decay and desolation. Abandoned for more than a decade, its ominous aura has beckoned adventurers and thrill-seekers alike. For an avid urban explorer like me, venturing into this eerie motel seemed like an irresistible challenge, especially at night. The Royal Hawaiian Motel, located in Baker, California, was relatively easy to access. There were no fences to hop over, no security guards patrolling the perimeter. I arrived on a warm summer night, parking my car discreetly on the side of the road. The cool desert air carried an unnatural stillness as I approached the structure, flashlight in hand. The first thing that struck me was the pool. Empty, cracked, and adorned with layers of vibrant graffiti, its hollow depths echoing a history of abandonment. As I swept my flashlight across the facade, the eerie sight of shattered windows and slightly ajar doors on the upper level sent chills down my spine. Among the wreckage, a charred portion of the motel stood as a haunting reminder of a fire that had devoured parts of the structure years ago. The quiet was oppressive. My footsteps crunched against debris, the only sound interrupting the otherwise tomb-like silence. I ventured further, peering into desolate rooms littered with broken furniture, graffiti, and remnants of forgotten lives. That's when I heard it, a faint voice, delicate yet chilling, drifting through the cold night air. It sounded distinctly female. My heart quickened. Was it someone like me, another explorer? Or was it something else entirely? Not wanting to take chances, I quickly ducked into a ground-floor room, turning off my flashlight and holding my breath. After a minute of nerve-wracking silence, I decided to continue exploring, convincing myself the voice must have been carried by the wind. Inside the room, the decaying walls bore ominous markings, while a dusty, abandoned mattress and a battered dresser stood as grim sentinels. I shuddered at the thought of someone using this place for shelter, though its remoteness seemed to argue otherwise. As I moved through the building, the sensation of being watched gnawed at me, though I dismissed it as paranoia. Then, a crashing sound above shattered my fragile composure. My heart froze as I aimed the flashlight at the walkway above, its beam illuminating the empty upper floor. Against better judgment, I climbed the stairs, my shoes scraping against the worn concrete. I explored the upper-level rooms, each more decrepit than the last. But then I heard it, a rhythmic, deliberate thumping sound. Thump, 2 seconds, thump, 2 seconds, thump. The noise was coming from one of the rooms just ahead. As I stepped closer, the thumping stopped abruptly. A cold wave of dread washed over me. Someone or something was there. Summoning the last of my courage, I announced my presence. "Hello. I'm just exploring. I mean no harm." The room, cloaked in shadows, was barely illuminated by my dim flashlight. In the faint glow, I thought I glimpsed a figure, motionless, lurking near the far wall. My hands trembled as I angled the light towards the ground and tried to steel my nerves. When I raised the flashlight again, my blood turned to ice. Pale, bare feet came rushing towards me. I jolted the beam upward, revealing a gaunt woman with a blood-streaked forehead and yellowish slime dripping from her agape mouth. Her bloodshot eyes locked onto me, radiating pure madness. For a brief second, I froze in shock, but her guttural scream catapulted me into motion. I bolted, adrenaline surging as her anguished cries echoed behind me. The woman's footsteps thudded too close for comfort, fueling my panic. Down the stairs, through the motel's eerie corridors, and out into the desert night, I ran with all the speed I could muster. Reaching my car, I slammed the door shut, panting heavily as I fumbled to lock it. My heart thundered in my chest. She hadn't followed me to the car, but her haunting visage was etched into my mind. Shaken, I called my friend George, another urban explorer. Though he hadn't joined me that night, he listened intently as I described what I'd encountered. His chilling theory? The thumping sound was likely her repeatedly banging her head against the wall. I debated calling the police, reasoning that someone so unhinged needed help or containment. George dissuaded me, reminding me of the trespassing implications. Determined but cautious, I dialed the non-emergency line from a distance and reported the deranged woman anonymously. As I drove away, the road blurred through my tears. In all my years of exploration, I had never faced terror like that. Whoever she was, a lost soul, a squatter, or a figment of madness, I could only hope that no one else would ever have to face the nightmare lurking in the Royal Hawaiian Motel. The town of Tuscaloosa, Alabama, has its fair share of whispered legends, but none are as chilling as those surrounding the abandoned Bryce Hospital. Established in the mid-1800s as a psychiatric facility, the sprawling institution was once known for its progressive care. However, over the years, its reputation darkened, its name synonymous with cruelty and suffering. After closing in the early 2000s, the building was left to rot, becoming a haven for daring urban explorers and thrill seekers. I had heard the stories, rumors of shadowy figures moving in the windows, faint screams echoing from deep within the halls, and most disturbingly, accounts of visitors emerging from the building dazed and unhinged. For someone like me, curious and a bit reckless, it was too tempting to resist. I arrived at Bryce Hospital on a foggy October night. The imposing red brick building loomed over the overgrown grounds, its windows dark and hollow like empty eyes. Armed with only a flashlight, a camera, and a phone with limited battery, I stepped cautiously through a broken side entrance. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and decay. The peeling walls bore faded murals and graffiti, a haunting juxtaposition of past care and present desolation. My flashlight flickered across scattered papers, broken furniture, and rusted equipment. The floor creaked ominously beneath me as I made my way down a hallway, the silence around me oppressive. It wasn't long before I began hearing things. At first, it was subtle, a faint scuffling sound that I attributed to animals. But as I ventured deeper, the noises grew. Whispers, unintelligible yet persistent. I stopped in my tracks, shining the flashlight down the hall. Nothing. Only an eerie stillness and the faint echoes of my own breathing. Determined to keep going, I entered what appeared to be the old administrative offices. Dust-covered desks and filing cabinets lined the room. As I scanned my light across the walls, I noticed faded signs bearing the names of staff and patients. On one wall, in jagged red lettering that looked too fresh to be decades old, were the words, "Some doors should stay closed." I felt a chill creep up my spine. I turned back towards the hall, but a sudden metallic clang stopped me. It came from upstairs. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. The stairs groaned under my weight as I ascended, the flashlight barely piercing the darkness ahead. At the top, a long corridor stretched before me, lined with patient rooms. Most were empty, their doors ajar, revealing shattered beds and rusting fixtures. Then I saw it. The last door on the left was closed, its surface scratched as though something, or someone, had clawed at it from both sides. As I approached, I noticed a faint glow seeping through the cracks. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But curiosity outweighed fear. I pushed the door open. Inside, the glow came from an old-fashioned lamp flickering on a small table. The room was eerily intact, unlike the rest of the building. A bed with crisp white sheets stood against one wall, and a chair faced the window, its back to me. Someone was sitting in the chair. "Hello!" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. I stepped closer, flashlight aimed at the chair, the beam trembling as much as my hands. What I saw made my blood run cold. The figure was a woman in a tattered hospital gown, her head tilted at an unnatural angle as though her neck were broken. Her face was hidden by her dark, matted hair. Suddenly, her head snapped upright, and she turned to face me. Her eyes were hollow pits of darkness, and a grotesque smile spread across her face. She let out a low, guttural laugh that quickly escalated into an ear-piercing scream. I stumbled backward, my flashlight tumbling to the floor and plunging the room into darkness. In the chaos, I could hear her footsteps, erratic and approaching fast. Grabbing the flashlight, I sprinted back into the hall, my heart pounding as her laughter echoed behind me. I didn't stop to look back. I only ran down the stairs, through the crumbling halls, and out into the cold night air. Breathless, I reached my car, fumbling with the keys as the laughter faded. I jumped inside and locked the doors, my hands shaking violently. As I drove away, the building disappeared into the distance, but the terror stayed with me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of her hollow eyes haunted me, and her laughter replayed in my mind like a broken record. But what truly unsettled me was the discovery I made days later. When I reviewed the photos I had taken, one caught my attention. It was of the scratched door, the one I had opened. In the photo behind me was a shadowy figure staring straight into the lens. And it was smiling. That was the last time I ever stepped foot in an abandoned building. Some places, like Bryce Hospital, aren't just haunted. They're alive, feeding on the fear of those foolish enough to enter. And once they've seen you, they never let you go. The little town of Elmhurst was like any other: quiet streets, friendly neighbors, and a sense of normalcy that blanketed the lives of its residents. But tucked away at the edge of town, beyond the old train tracks, was an abandoned house that nobody talked about. Children whispered about it on Halloween, calling it Shadow House, but most townsfolk simply ignored it. That house, with its sagging roof and shattered windows, was rumored to be cursed. The tales always led back to one figure: the woman in the shadows. Chapter 1: The Dare. It started on a crisp autumn evening when Melissa, Caleb, and Ryan decided to push each other's limits. Boredom and teenage bravado were a dangerous mix. "Let's see who's brave enough to go inside the shadow house," Caleb dared, smirking. Ryan's face went pale. "That place gives me the creeps." Melissa rolled her eyes. "You're scared of an old house? Seriously?" She adjusted her jacket and added, "Fine, I'll go. But you two are coming with me." No one wanted to back down. Chapter 2: Entering the Shadow House. Armed with flashlights and nothing else, the trio crossed the train tracks and approached the house. Its silhouette was haunting against the twilight sky, and the cracked front door swayed faintly, as if welcoming them inside. "Ladies first," Caleb teased, but his voice shook. The air was cold and heavy as they stepped into the dusty, decrepit entryway. Cobwebs hung in thick curtains, and the smell of mildew was overwhelming. A grandfather clock stood in the corner, eerily silent. "This isn't so bad," Melissa said, but her bravado sounded forced. As they explored, strange things started happening. Footsteps echoed from the floors above, though the house had been vacant for decades. Whispers seemed to flit past their ears, just out of comprehension. "It's the wind," Ryan said, his voice shaky. "Old houses make noises." But the sound wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming closer. Chapter 3: The First Encounter. In the main hallway, they discovered a photograph nailed to the wall. It was yellowed and faded, but still showed a strikingly beautiful woman in a long, dark dress. Her expression was unreadable, her eyes intense. "That's her," Caleb whispered. "The woman in the shadows." Melissa scoffed. "It's just a picture." As she turned away, the flashlight in her hand flickered and died. Ryan screamed. "Someone touched me," he cried, scrambling back. The light sputtered back to life, illuminating the hallway, and in that instant Melissa saw her. Standing at the end of the hall was the woman from the photograph. Her shadow stretched impossibly long, pooling around her like spilled ink. She didn't move, but her eyes followed them, unblinking and full of malice. "Run," Caleb said, barely above a whisper. Chapter 4: Trapped. The three bolted for the door, but as they reached the entryway, the wooden floor seemed to warp and shift. The shadows grew thicker, clinging to them, slowing their escape. "We're not alone," Melissa whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of their panicked breaths. The air grew colder, their breaths fogging in the dim light. In the distance, the faint sound of a woman humming filled the air, a haunting melody that seemed to resonate from the walls themselves. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. "She doesn't want us to leave," Ryan stammered, tears streaming down his face. Chapter 5: The Cellar. With no way out, they decided to find another exit. Their search led them to a narrow staircase leading into the basement. Against every instinct, they descended into the darkness. The cellar was worse than they imagined. The air was damp and putrid, and the ground was littered with strange, brittle objects. As Melissa's light swept the room, she froze. In the far corner, there was a small table with something laid neatly across it, a black veil and a rusted photograph frame holding an image of the same woman. "What is this place?" Caleb muttered, his voice cracking. "She was waiting for us," came a voice. It wasn't Ryan, and it wasn't Caleb. It was the woman's voice. The shadows in the room swirled and stretched, forming a figure that stood taller than the ceiling allowed. The woman's face emerged from the darkness, distorted and grinning unnaturally wide. "Stay with me," she said, her voice echoing as though it came from the very bones of the house. Chapter 6: The Final Choice. Panic gripped the trio as they darted for the stairs, but no matter how fast they moved, the exit seemed to slip further away. Ryan fell to the ground, screaming as shadows wrapped around his ankles, dragging him back. "Help me," he cried, his voice disappearing into the void as he was swallowed whole. Melissa and Caleb reached the top of the stairs, slamming into the closed door. Behind them, the woman's laughter erupted, a guttural, otherworldly sound that shook the walls. "She won't let us go," Caleb shouted. "Don't look back," Melissa whispered, her hand on the doorknob. "We can't look at her," Summoning every ounce of strength, Melissa twisted the knob, and the door flew open, spilling them into the night. Chapter 7, Aftermath. The two didn't stop running until they reached the train tracks. The house stood in the distance, dark and silent once more. Caleb collapsed onto the ground, sobbing. "She took him," he gasped. "She took Ryan." Melissa turned to look at the house one last time. In the upstairs window, she saw a figure standing silently, a pale face staring back at her. It was Ryan, but his eyes, they were wrong. Hollow. Empty. Epilogue, the next chapter. Melissa and Caleb never spoke of the night again. The police searched for Ryan, but found no evidence of him or the terrifying events inside the house. Months later, Melissa began to notice something strange. Shadows seemed to linger in her peripheral vision, and at night, she'd hear faint humming just outside her window. She knew the truth. Once the woman in the shadows saw you, she never truly let you go.